History records that the devil took his own life with a coward's bullet. But the testimony of the last surviving witness suggests he was already dead before he pulled the trigger. The file is dated April 30th, 1945. The location is 50 feet beneath the burning ruins of Berlin in the concrete bowels of the Führerbunker. The air is recycled, stale, and thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and concrete dust. Above ground, the Soviet Red Army is less than 300 meters away. The rhythmic thud of heavy artillery is constant, a heartbeat of the apocalypse shaking the walls. Even the lights flicker with every impact. But at 15:30 hours, a different sound cuts through the dull roar of the shelling. It is sharp. It is close. It is the dry crack of a single gunshot from the private study at the end of the corridor. For the generals and secretaries huddling in the hallway, that sound is the end of the Third Reich. It is the signal they have been waiting for, the permission to finally flee the rat trap. But for Rochus Misch, the SS Oberscharführer sitting at the telephone switchboard, that gunshot does not bring relief. It brings a cold, sickening realization. He flinches not because of the noise, but because of the silence that follows. He stares at the blinking lights on his console, his mind racing back to exactly 20 minutes ago. He knows the official story is already being written. Suicide, a pact of death between the Führer and his new bride, Eva Braun. But Rochus Misch knows something that will be omitted from the history books for decades. He knows that just 5 minutes before that shot was fired, a cup of tea was carried into that room. And he knows with terrifying certainty that it was not the tea Hitler had ordered. It was a cup that had been switched in the corridor by the only man in the bunker physically capable of overpowering the dictator. How does the most protected man in history die of a gunshot wound if he was already poisoned? And why did his most loyal adjutant intervene to change the tray at the last possible second? To understand the secrets of that final claustrophobic hour, we must step back into the shadows of the bunker 5 years earlier to meet the man who became the furniture of the regime. Rochus Misch was a man designed to be overlooked, standing 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders of the SS Leibstandarte. He was nevertheless a ghost in the machine of the Third Reich. He was not a strategist, a politician, or a fanatic ideologue. He was, in his own words, the furniture. As the Führer's personal bodyguard, courier, and telephone operator for 5 years, he possessed a security clearance higher than most generals, yet he was treated with the indifference one shows to a lamp or a chair. This invisibility was his greatest asset. Generals discussed secret troop movements in front of him. Mistresses whispered their fears. Hitler himself, a man who famously hid his tremors and his rages from the public, unmasked himself completely in Misch's presence. He was the silent recording device in the corner of the room, absorbing the secrets of a dying empire. By late April 1945, the atmosphere inside the bunker had shifted from desperation to clinical insanity. The concrete tomb was a pressure cooker of hysteria, fueled by alcohol, fear, and the relentless pounding of Soviet artillery. Day and night had lost their meaning under the artificial hum of the ventilation fans. In this subterranean asylum, Rochus Misch sat at his switchboard, connecting calls to armies that no longer existed, watching the disintegration of the man he had sworn to protect. He saw the trembling hands that Hitler could no longer control. He saw the vacant stare of a man navigating a map of delusions. But the true collapse began not with a Soviet tank, but with a piece of paper. On April 28th, the final illusion shattered. A report from Reuters news agency was brought down the stairs. It contained the unthinkable. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, the loyal Heinrich, the man who had built the terror state, was secretly negotiating a surrender with the Western Allies. He was trying to save his own skin by selling out his master. The effect on Hitler was catastrophic. Witnesses described a rage that transcended simple anger. It was the primal scream of a man realizing he is alone in a room full of knives. If the head of the SS could betray him, then loyalty was a myth. Every face in the bunker became a mask concealing a traitor. The paranoia that had always simmered beneath the surface now boiled over, consuming everything. Hitler looked at his doctors and saw poisoners. He looked at his generals and saw spies. He looked at the cyanide capsules in his pocket, the very tools of his escape, and wondered if they too were part of the trap. Was the poison real, or was it a sedative designed to deliver him alive into a cage in Moscow? The seed of the final conspiracy was planted in that moment of absolute distrust. The paranoia demanded a sacrifice. By the afternoon of April 29th, Hitler's distrust had metastasized into a frantic obsession with the mechanism of his own death. He was terrified that the SS doctors on Himmler's orders had replaced the lethal potassium cyanide with a paralytic agent. He imagined a scenario where he would bite the capsule, fall into a stupor, and wake up in a cage in Moscow, put on display like a circus animal for Stalin's amusement. He needed proof. He needed a test subject. And in the claustrophobic cruelty of the bunker, there was only one candidate, Blondie, his beloved German shepherd, the only living thing he still seemed to regard with affection. The scene described by witnesses is one of chilling clinical detachment. Dr. Werner Hasse was summoned to the latrine area, the only place with a drain for the fluids. Hitler watched like a stone statue as the doctor forced the dog's mouth open and crushed the glass ampule with a pair of pliers. The reaction was immediate. The scent of bitter almonds filled the small, tiled space. The dog convulsed once and collapsed. Death was instantaneous. But even this sacrifice did not silence the voices in Hitler's head. Misch recalled seeing the Führer stare at the corpse of the dog, not with grief, but with a lingering suspicion. The poison worked on the dog, yes, but was the capsule in his own pocket the same batch? Or had they switched it while he slept? The test had proven the efficacy of the chemistry, but it had done nothing to cure the rot of betrayal. The sun rose on April 30th, though no one underground could see it. It was the day the world would change, but inside the bunker, it began with a surreal banality. At 14:30 hours, Adolf Hitler sat down for his final meal. It was not a feast of kings, it was a plate of spaghetti with a light tomato sauce, eaten in near silence with his two secretaries. The man who had conquered Europe was now a trembling wreck, ravaged by advanced Parkinson's disease. Misch observed from the doorway that Hitler could barely hold his fork. The utensil rattled against the china, a pathetic rhythmic tapping that echoed in the quiet room. He spilled sauce on his tunic. He stared at the wall, his eyes glazed and watery, already looking past the concrete into the void that awaited him. When the meal was finished, the long, slow procession of farewells began. It was a ritual of the walking dead. Hitler moved down the line of his staff, shaking hands, mumbling incoherent thanks. He came to Magda Goebbels, the wife of his propaganda minister, who pleaded with him to flee to save himself. He looked at her with eyes that were already glass and simply shook his head. The decision was made. The script was written. He turned to Rochus Misch, his loyal telephone operator, and gave his final specific domestic order. It was a request for tea. "Prepare it now," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Bring it to the study in exactly 10 minutes. We wish to be undisturbed." It sounded like a routine request for an afternoon break. In reality, it was the signal for the execution to begin. At 1500 hours, Rochus Misch stepped into the small pantry to perform the final duty of his service. The mundane nature of the task was surreal against the backdrop of the apocalypse. While Soviet shells pulverized the Chancellery garden above, Misch carefully boiled water. He arranged the delicate porcelain cups on a silver tray. He selected the cookies the Führer preferred. It was a domestic ritual performed in the antechamber of death. His hands were steady, grounded by the routine he had performed 1,000 times before. He did not know that he was preparing the last drink Adolf Hitler would ever request. Or rather, the last drink he thought he would receive. Misch checked the time. 15:10. He lifted the heavy tray and stepped out into the narrow concrete corridor. The hallway was dimly lit, the air thick with diesel fumes from the ventilation generators. He walked toward the heavy steel door of the private study, the only sound the crunch of dust beneath his boots. He was 10 steps away from the door when a shadow detached itself from the wall and blocked his path. It was SS Sturmbannführer Otto Günsche. Günsche was a giant of a man, standing nearly 2 meters tall, a towering physical presence who served as Hitler's personal adjutant. He was the man responsible for the Führer's physical safety, the only one strong enough to carry a corpse up the stairs. But in this moment, he was not standing guard. He was waiting. Misch stopped, the tray rattling slightly in his hands. He expected Günsche to step aside, to open the door as he always did. Instead, the adjutant took a step forward, his face slick with sweat, his eyes darting nervously toward the study door. The tension radiating off him was palpable, a vibration of pure dread that filled the narrow space. "Give me the tray," Günsche ordered. His voice was low, tight, and brokered no argument. Misch hesitated. This was a breach of protocol. The order had been specific. Misch was to bring the tea. "The Führer ordered me to," Misch began, but Günsche cut him off with a sharp gesture. The giant SS officer reached out and physically took the silver tray from Misch's hands. He turned and set it down on a small side table in the corridor, abandoning it next to a pile of maps. Then he did something that would haunt Misch for the rest of his life. Günsche reached into the shadows of the alcove behind him and picked up a different tray. It was prepared exactly like the first, same pot, same cups, but it had been waiting there, hidden in the dark. The switch was seamless, practiced, and deliberate. Günsche turned back to the study door, balancing the new tray in his massive hand. He looked at Misch one last time, his expression unreadable, a mixture of grim determination and something that looked like pity. "I will take this in," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You go back to the switchboard. Do not disturb us." Misch stood frozen in the corridor. He watched as Günsche opened the heavy steel door, slipped inside, and closed it with a soft final click. The original tea, the one Hitler had ordered, sat cooling on the side table, untouched. The wrong tea had gone into the room. The door was sealed. The stage was set. Rochus Misch returned to his small workspace, a cubicle no larger than a closet, and sat before the blinking lights of the telephone switchboard. The time was 15:15. For the next 15 minutes, the bunker fell into a state of suspended animation. The chaos of the previous days evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, heavy silence that pressed against the eardrums. In the corridor, just meters away from the study door, Magda Goebbels sat at a small table playing solitaire. The rhythmic snap, snap, snap of the cards was the only sound in the underworld, a metronome counting down the final seconds of the regime. Misch watched her hands. They were trembling, but she continued to play, turning over the jack of spades, the queen of hearts, waiting for the sound that would signal the end of her own life and the lives of her 6 children. Inside the study, behind the soundproof steel door, the final act was playing out. We can only speculate on the conversation, but we know the mechanics. The tea brought in on the second tray by Otto Günsche was consumed. Was it fortified with a sedative to steady the Führer's shaking hand? Was it laced with a faster-acting poison to ensure the cyanide capsule wasn't a dud? Or was it simply a distraction, a moment of comfort before the violence? Misch stared at the closed door, his mind racing. He knew the timeline, he knew the order, and he knew that whatever was in that cup was currently coursing through the veins of the man who had set the world on fire. At 15:30, the silence was shattered. It was not a roar, but a sharp, flat crack. A single gunshot. It didn't echo long in the dampened corridor. It was swallowed by the concrete. Magda Goebbels froze, a card hovering in midair. Misch flinched at his console. He didn't move immediately, he waited. The protocol for this moment had never been written, but the instinct of the bodyguard kicked in. He stood up, his hand hovering near his holster, though there was no enemy to fight. Moments later, the study door opened. The smell hit them first, a sickening metallic cocktail of cordite, old blood, and the unmistakable sweet stench of bitter almonds. Heinz Linge, the valet, and Otto Günsche stepped out. Their faces were pale masks of shock. They beckoned Misch forward. He moved to the doorway and looked inside. The scene was a tableau of grotesque stillness. Adolf Hitler was slumped on the floral sofa, his head canted forward. There was a bullet wound in his right temple, blood dripping slowly onto the carpet. Next to him, Eva Braun sat with her legs drawn up, her head resting on his shoulder, dead from poison, her face peaceful. But Rochus Misch's eyes did not linger on the bodies. Trained to observe the details of a room, his gaze drifted to the low table in front of the sofa. The pistol, a Walther PPK, lay on the floor where it had fallen from Hitler's hand, but on the table sitting next to the crushed brass casing of a cyanide ampoule was the porcelain cup from the second tray. It was empty. The tea was gone. The switch had served its purpose. Whatever Otto Günsche had carried into that room had been consumed to the last drop, ensuring that the suicide was not a question of will, but a matter of chemical certainty. The aftermath of April 30th was a clumsy attempt to erase the truth with gasoline. The bodies were carried up the stairs to the Chancellery garden, doused in petrol, and set alight. But fire is a fickle eraser. On May 5th, agents of Smersh, the Soviet counterintelligence service, recovered the charred remains from a shell crater. The autopsy conducted by Soviet pathologists was a classified state secret for decades, but the fragments that have leaked paint a disturbing picture. They found glass shards in the jaw, consistent with the cyanide capsule. But reports also noted a peculiar chemical burning in the stomach lining and a residue that did not match the profile of a simple capsule ingestion. Something else had been introduced to the system, something liquid, something delivered in a porcelain cup just minutes before the end. Stalin himself never believed the suicide story, reportedly telling his inner circle that the old man had been silenced by his own people. The man who held the key to this mystery, Otto Günsche, took the secret to his grave. He survived the Soviet gulags, returned to Germany, and lived a quiet life until his death in 2003. For 50 years, he refused to discuss the final 5 minutes in the study. He was the loyal soldier to the end, but we must ask, was the switch an act of mercy? Was the tea laced with a sedative to steady the hand of a man shaking too violently to aim a pistol? Or was it an order from Martin Bormann, a final insurance policy to ensure the Führer died on schedule, preventing him from changing his will or surrendering in a moment of weakness? Günsche's silence was the final lock on the bunker door. Rochus Misch outlived them all. He died in 2013, the last living witness to the collapse of the Third Reich. Until his final breath, he was haunted not by the sound of the gunshot, but by the image of that silver tray abandoned in the corridor. He was the man who followed orders. He prepared the tea the Führer asked for, but he lived with the knowledge that his tea was never drunk. He was the unintended witness to a quiet, final coup d'etat carried out in a pantry. History says Hitler killed himself. But the man at the switchboard knew the truth. The execution began the moment the wrong cup entered the room. And now, when the story is told, the silence feels especially heavy. Before my eyes, I still see that abandoned tray on the side table, the steam rising from a cup that was ordered but never touched. That is exactly why I cannot simply close this file and forget, because forgetting is the final betrayal we can commit toward the truth. We accept the simple headline, "Suicide," because it is clean, but the truth is often sitting in the shadows waiting on a different tray. If you listen to the end, it means this matters to you too. Just let me know you're here, that I'm not telling this into the void.